Sir, I need to see your ID. What's your status here?
I'm on my property. What lawful reason do you have to demand ID?
You match a description. Are you refusing to cooperate?
Without reasonable suspicion.
The morning air in the affluent suburb of Oak Ridge was heavy with the scent of damp pine needles and freshly brewed coffee seeping from the vents of high-end homes. It was a Tuesday, shortly after 8 in the morning, the kind of quiet hour where the only sounds were the distant hum of lawnmowers and the occasional rustle of a sprinkler system coming to life. Parked half a block down from a sprawling, slate-roofed colonial, Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agent Mark Davies sat in the driver's seat of his unmarked fleet vehicle, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm on the steering wheel. Davies was a 12-year veteran of the agency, a man who prided himself on his gut instincts, a nebulous internal compass that he believed had never steered him wrong. Over the years, that instinct had slowly calcified into a rigid set of assumptions, a mental shorthand that allowed him to bypass the tedious, rigorous steps of standard police work in favor of quick, aggressive action. He was officially in the neighborhood following up on a stale tip regarding a fugitive with an expired visa who was rumored to be doing landscaping work in the area. The description was vague: a tall man of color, medium build, late 40s to early 50s. It was the kind of flimsy, catch-all description that required careful, methodical corroboration. But Davies was tired, his coffee had gone cold, and he was eager to put a win on the board before the end of his shift. His eyes locked onto the driveway of the colonial house as the heavy oak front door swung open. A man stepped out onto the porch. He was black, tall, perhaps in his late 50s, dressed in faded gray sweatpants, a plain white t-shirt, and slip-on loafers. He was holding a ceramic coffee mug and casually walking down the brick pathway to retrieve the morning newspaper lying near the mailbox. Davies leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized the man. The agent's mind immediately began connecting dots that didn't exist, driven by a profound, unexamined bias. He saw a man who loosely fit a vague physical profile standing in a neighborhood where Davies subconsciously felt he didn't belong, at an hour when most residents were already commuting to corporate offices. The fact that the man was comfortably dressed and holding a coffee mug on his own property did not register to Davies as the behavior of a homeowner. Instead, his skewed perception framed it as the relaxed posture of an off-the-books laborer taking a break before a shift. Davies reached for his door handle. In his mind, he had crossed the threshold of reasonable suspicion, the legal standard required to briefly detain someone for questioning. But true reasonable suspicion requires specific, articulable facts that indicate a person is committing, has committed, or is about to commit a crime. A vague resemblance to a generalized description in a residential neighborhood was not enough, but Davies had long ago stopped caring about the finer points of the Fourth Amendment. He stepped out of the vehicle, the heavy thud of the car door echoing sharply in the quiet street, and began walking briskly toward the property line. Marcus Vance picked up the damp newspaper, his mind already shifting toward the heavy docket waiting for him at the federal courthouse downtown. He took a sip of his coffee, enjoying the crisp morning air, when he heard the heavy, purposeful footsteps approaching on the asphalt. He turned to see a white man in plain clothes, wearing a tactical vest over a polo shirt with an ICE placard clearly visible on the chest, marching up his driveway. Vance's brow furrowed slightly in confusion, but his demeanor remained calm. He was a man accustomed to conflict, having spent 3 decades navigating the treacherous waters of the legal system, first as a public defender, then as a federal prosecutor, and for the last 8 years as a judge on the United States District Court. He knew exactly where he stood, both geographically and legally. He was standing within the curtilage of his home, an area intimately tied to the home itself, where the highest expectations of privacy under the Constitution are guaranteed. Davies stopped a few feet short of the property line, resting his hand casually near his duty belt, an unspoken physical intimidation tactic he used to establish dominance. "Morning," Davies said, his voice carrying a sharp, commanding edge that demanded immediate compliance rather than offering a greeting. Vance nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the agent, noting the absence of a partner, the lack of a visible warrant, and the aggressive posture. "Good morning," Vance replied, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that betrayed no anxiety. "Can I help you with something, officer?" Davies stepped over the invisible boundary separating the public sidewalk from the private brick pathway of the driveway, a critical spatial and legal misstep. "Agent Davies, ICE," he said, skipping any explanation for his presence. "I need to see some identification, buddy. Let's see an ID." The casual, diminutive use of the word buddy immediately signaled to Vance the nature of the interaction. This was not a consensual encounter. It was an attempt at an investigatory stop based on a deeply flawed premise. Vance did not move his hands, nor did he break eye contact. He knew the law intimately. Without reasonable, articulable suspicion of a crime, an officer cannot demand identification from a person simply standing on their own property. "I'm afraid I don't have my wallet on me," Vance said calmly, gesturing slightly with his coffee mug toward his sweatpants. "I just stepped out to get the paper. What is this regarding Agent Davies?" The polite refusal felt like a slap in the face to Davies. In his world, hesitation was suspicious, and a refusal to comply immediately was tantamount to an admission of guilt. The agent's confirmation bias flared up. He was now convinced he had found his guy, a fugitive trying to play games. "Don't play dumb with me," Davies snapped, taking another step forward, deeply penetrating the curtilage of the property without a warrant, without probable cause, and without exigent circumstances. "I am conducting an investigation into individuals overstaying work visas in this area. You fit the description of a fugitive. Now, you can either produce a state ID, or I can detain you right here until we figure out exactly who you are and where you belong." Vance's expression hardened, though his voice never raised above a conversational volume. He was watching a textbook civil rights violation unfold in real time on his own front lawn. "Agent Davies," Vance said, his tone shifting from casual homeowner to the authoritative cadence he used in the courtroom. "You are currently standing on private property. You have articulated no specific facts to suggest I have committed a crime. A generalized description is insufficient for an investigatory stop under Terry v. Ohio, and you certainly do not have probable cause to effectuate an arrest or demand identification while I am standing at my own residence. I am going to politely ask you to step off my property." The legal precision of the response should have been a massive flashing red warning light for Davies. An undocumented laborer or a frightened fugitive does not cite Supreme Court precedent regarding the Fourth Amendment while calmly drinking coffee. But Davies was blinded by his own ego and his preconceived notions. He didn't hear a citizen exercising constitutional rights. He heard defiance from a man he had already judged. "All right, we're doing this the hard way," Davies growled, his patience evaporating. He lunged forward, closing the distance in a second. He grabbed Vance's right arm, the sudden violent motion causing the coffee mug to slip from the older man's grasp and shatter on the brick walkway, hot liquid splashing across the pristine shoes of both men. Vance stiffened, a surge of adrenaline hitting his system, but his legal training overpowered his natural instinct to physically resist. He knew that any struggle, even against an unlawful arrest, could be twisted into a charge of resisting a law enforcement officer or assaulting a federal agent. "You are making a profound mistake, Agent," Vance said, his voice chillingly steady as Davies aggressively twisted his arm behind his back. "You are effectuating a warrantless arrest within the curtilage of a home without probable cause. You are violating my civil rights." Davies scoffed, retrieving a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. "Save it for the judge, buddy," he mocked, missing the profound irony of his own words. He clicked the cold metal cuffs tightly around Vance's wrists, intentionally ratcheting them a notch too tight. A petty, punitive measure designed to inflict discomfort. By this point, the commotion had drawn the attention of the neighborhood. A woman jogging with a golden retriever stopped on the sidewalk, pulling out her phone to record the interaction. An older neighbor across the street stepped out onto his porch, watching in stunned silence as a highly respected member of the community was being manhandled in his sweatpants. Davies ignored them, fueled by the adrenaline of the arrest. He marched Vance down the driveway, his hand firmly gripping the back of the older man's t-shirt, and shoved him into the cramped, hard plastic back seat of the unmarked SUV. The drive to the local processing facility was suffocatingly silent. Davies kept his eyes on the road, occasionally glancing in the rear-view mirror, expecting his prisoner to beg, plead, or confess. Instead, Vance sat perfectly upright, his face a mask of absolute calm, his mind meticulously logging every procedural failure, every constitutional violation, every arrogant assumption the agent had made. He was memorizing badge numbers, noting the time of the arrest, the exact location on the driveway where the physical detainment occurred, and the precise words exchanged. When they arrived at the federal holding facility, Davies pulled the vehicle into the sally port, feeling the familiar rush of satisfaction that came with a completed arrest. He pulled Vance from the vehicle and marched him through the heavy metal doors into the harsh, fluorescent-lit intake area. The room smelled of floor wax and stale sweat. A few other agents were milling about, processing paperwork or drinking coffee. At the front desk sat Desk Sergeant Hernandez, a weary veteran who had seen every type of criminal and every type of mistake walk through those doors. "Got a live one, Davies?" Hernandez asked, not looking up from his computer screen. "Yeah," Davies replied, a smirk playing on his lips. "Uncooperative. Fits the profile for the Oak Ridge fugitive. Refused to ID, got combative when I tried to verify his status. We'll need to run his prints to find out who he actually is." Hernandez sighed and finally looked up. His eyes moved past Davies and landed on the man in handcuffs. The sergeant's fingers froze over his keyboard. The color drained from his face so rapidly that Davies thought the man was having a medical emergency. Hernandez stood up slowly, his chair rolling back and hitting the wall with a loud clatter. The noise drew the attention of the shift supervisor, Supervisory Agent Miller, who walked out of his glass-walled office holding a stack of files. "What's the problem, Hernandez?" Miller asked, before his gaze followed the sergeant's line of sight. Miller stopped dead in his tracks. The files slipped from his hands, scattering across the linoleum floor. A profound, suffocating silence descended over the intake room. It was the kind of silence that precedes a devastating explosion. Davies looked back and forth between Hernandez and Miller, a creeping sense of dread finally beginning to pierce through his veil of arrogance. "Sir," Miller choked out, his voice barely a whisper, addressing the man in the handcuffs. "Your Honor, what is happening here?" Davies felt the floor drop out from beneath him. The air was sucked from his lungs. "Your Honor." The words echoed in his skull like a physical blow. He slowly turned his head to look at the man he had just dragged out of his own driveway. Marcus Vance stood tall, his hands bound behind his back, his expression completely devoid of anger, replaced instead by a cold, calculating judicial authority. "Good morning, Supervisory Agent Miller," Vance said, his baritone voice filling the quiet room. "Your agent here, Mr. Davies, has decided to conduct a warrantless arrest on my property. He bypassed the requirement for probable cause, initiated an unlawful Terry stop based on a racially motivated assumption, physically assaulted me, and detained me without legal justification. I suggested to him that he was making a procedural error, but he informed me that I should save it for the judge. So, here I am." The sheer magnitude of the disaster settled over Davies like a lead weight. He hadn't just arrested the wrong man, he had illegally assaulted and kidnapped a sitting United States District Judge, a man who possessed a masterful understanding of the law and the power to absolutely destroy careers. Miller's face turned a violent shade of red. He didn't yell at Davies. The situation was far beyond yelling. He walked forward with trembling hands, retrieved a set of keys from his belt, and gently unlocked the handcuffs from Vance's wrists. "Your Honor, I cannot express how profoundly sorry I am," Miller stammered, stepping back. "This is an egregious violation of protocol. We will handle this immediately." Vance rubbed his wrists slowly, feeling the deep red indentations left by the tight steel. He looked at Davies, who was now visibly shaking, his arrogant posture completely collapsed. "You don't need to apologize to me, Mr. Miller," Vance said quietly. "Apologies do not repair constitutional breaches. Agent Davies did not make a simple mistake. A mistake is a typo on a warrant. What Agent Davies did was act on a deeply ingrained presumption of guilt based on what he saw, rather than what the law requires. He allowed his personal bias to override the Fourth Amendment. If he is willing to do this to a federal judge in broad daylight in an affluent neighborhood, I shudder to think what he does to marginalized individuals in the shadows who do not have the legal vocabulary to defend themselves." Vance turned and walked toward the exit, his ruined shoes squeaking slightly on the linoleum. He paused at the door, looking back one last time. "I expect a full report of this incident on my desk by tomorrow morning, and I assure you my legal counsel will be in contact with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division before noon. Have a good day, gentlemen." As the heavy door clicked shut behind the judge, Davies knew his life as he knew it was over. But the fallout was not cinematic. It wasn't a shouting match or an instant firing. It was far worse. It was the slow, agonizing, bureaucratic meat grinder of the justice system turning its unblinking eye toward him. The consequences unfolded with brutal administrative precision. Davies was immediately stripped of his badge and weapon and placed on unpaid administrative leave pending a massive internal affairs investigation. His union representative, usually a loud and aggressive defender of officers, took one look at the neighbor's cell phone footage and the arrest report and quietly advised Davies to start looking for a civilian defense attorney. But the internal investigation was only the beginning. 3 weeks later, Davies was served with a massive federal civil lawsuit. Vance was not suing for money. He was suing to make a point, filing a Bivens action for the deprivation of his constitutional rights under color of law. In a normal situation, Davies would have hidden behind the shield of qualified immunity, a legal doctrine that protects government officials from civil liability unless they violated a clearly established statutory or constitutional right. But Vance's legal team was ruthless and precise. They meticulously documented how Davies' actions, arresting a man within the curtilage of his home without a warrant, exigent circumstances, or probable cause, were textbook violations of clearly established Fourth Amendment law. The federal court agreed. In a devastating ruling, the judge presiding over the civil case stripped Davies of his qualified immunity, stating that no reasonable officer could have believed that approaching a man on his own property, without specific facts of a crime, and physically detaining him for refusing to provide identification, was lawful. Without the protection of qualified immunity, the agency completely abandoned Davies to limit their own liability. He was officially terminated, his pension frozen, and he was left personally liable for hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. The Department of Justice initiated a pattern or practice investigation into Davies' past arrests, uncovering dozens of similar, though less publicized, procedural violations against immigrants and minorities who hadn't had the voice or resources to fight back. His previous cases were reviewed, convictions were overturned, and the gut instinct he had so proudly relied upon was exposed in federal reports as nothing more than systemic racial profiling masquerading as police work. Years later, Davies found himself working night security at a suburban strip mall, a ghost of his former self, endlessly replaying that crisp Tuesday morning in his head. He realized too late that the badge he wore was not a license to act on his assumptions, but a heavy burden that demanded strict adherence to the law. He had looked at Marcus Vance and seen a stereotype, a problem to be solved with force, entirely blinded to the reality standing in front of him. The true tragedy, he finally understood, wasn't just that he had arrested a judge. It was the terrifying realization of how easily and routinely the rights of ordinary people are trampled when those in power substitute their own prejudices for probable cause. When the system functions not on facts but on the flawed biases of the people enforcing it, who else is quietly having their freedom stripped away on their own front lawn, lacking the title or the knowledge to stop it?